It was October 1996, one of those months when the wind across the Nevada desert seemed to carry not just dust and cold, but also the invisible weight of a silence that crushed the chest. Near the famous extraterrestrial highway, that stretch of asphalt cutting through miles of emptiness and becoming legend among truckers, mystery hunters, and the curious in search of the improbable. There was a man who sought nothing but oblivion. His name was Mark, 52 years old, a retired mechanic, survivor of a tragedy that had broken him inside. He wasn't there looking for answers, much less adventures. He was there to stop, to dissolve slowly into the desert, like one more carcass forgotten by time. His trailer sat off the main road, parked on a patch of arid land where only the distant howl of coyotes and the crackle of wood in the night's chill reminded him that life still existed. Inside the small metal space, a ghostly routine repeated itself. Wake up late, heat up reheated coffee, tinker idly with tools that no longer had purpose, and finally spend hours staring at an old radio that only picked up static and distant voices. On a makeshift shelf, a few photos of his son, killed in a car accident years before. Those images were the last thing tying him to the world of the living, but also the wound that never healed. Mark had decided he didn't want to fight anymore. The world, with its crowded roads, its noisy bars, its useless rush, no longer made sense. That's why the desert had become his refuge. Solitude was both his punishment and his anesthesia, and on that specific night, the sky seemed denser than usual, heavy with stars that shone as if watching his surrender. He lit a cigarette, opened the trailer door, and stood still before the vastness. The cold wind cut his face, but there was a certain comfort in feeling nature remind him that he still existed. There was nothing to wait for, nothing to wish for. The world had ended for him on the same day his son had taken his last breath. But then, something that didn't belong to his reality began to form on the horizon. First, it was just a distant point of light, easily mistaken for a shooting star. But this star didn't fall. It moved differently, erratic, impossible, as if defying all the laws he knew. Mark narrowed his eyes, the cigarette trembling between his calloused fingers. He'd heard stories in roadside diners. Truckers swore they'd seen inexplicable lights. Tourists told tales of ships slicing through Nevada's sky. He'd always thought it was all delusion, invention, cheap stories to sell newspapers. But what his eyes captured that night couldn't be reduced to hallucination. The light grew, approached. There was no sound, no engine, no whir of propellers, just a silence that seemed to swallow even the beat of his heart. Mark felt a shiver run up his spine. The air around him felt heavier, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. Then, before his incredulous eyes, the light descended. Not like a plane approaching a runway, not like a helicopter vibrating the air. It simply was there, before his trailer, landing with impossible gentleness. The ground didn't shake, the wind didn't blow. Just an intense brightness took over the sand around it. Mark took a step back, nearly tripping over his own feet. The cigarette fell from his hand and went out before it even touched the ground. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The fear, so familiar, gave way to something different. A strange sense of anticipation, as if he were facing something that somehow had already been waiting for him. It was then that, from the light, a figure emerged, tall, with humanoid contours, but undeniably different. The skin reflected shades of blue and silver, as if made from the starry night itself. The eyes weren't ordinary eyes. They emitted a soft, almost hypnotic luminosity, conveying calm rather than threat. Each step it took seemed to dissolve the fear inside Mark, replacing it with an inexplicable peace. In that instant, he understood a truth that would change his existence forever. Nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same after that night. Before that impossible night, there was an ordinary man crushed by human pains. Mark wasn't born for the desert. He'd spent most of his life amid the smell of burnt oil and the metallic clatter of workshops, with hands hardened by grease and eyes accustomed to engine smoke. He was a mechanic, the kind who understood a car's heart just by the sound of its engine. His pride came from work well done, from getting a broken machine back on the road. But there was something that defined his life more than any engine: his son. From early on, Mark took him to the workshop, showing how each gear had a function, how even the simplest screw made a difference for something larger to work. The boy grew up in that environment, learning not just about cars, but about his father's patience, about the importance of not giving up. There was a bond that couldn't be bought anywhere. They were, in a way, two soldiers against the world, linked by grease on their hands and easy laughter during work breaks. That's why the accident made no sense. A damned intersection, a distracted driver, and everything ended in seconds. The news hit Mark like a thunderbolt splitting a clear sky in two. He rushed to the hospital, but there was no time, no miracles, no explanations. The boy he loved, the only reason his days had rhythm, was gone. And Mark discovered there is no greater silence than that of a hospital room after someone loved stops breathing. The following months were a blur. Friends tried to help, neighbours offered words that sounded hollow, and even the workshop seemed to mock him, reminding him of the time when his son was still by his side. He tried to endure, but every corner of the city was an open wound. The bar where they gathered, the school his son attended, even the roads where they drove together were invisible knives carved into his memory. That's when he made the decision: flee. Not to start over, but to stop. Not to seek peace, but to suffocate the noise of pain. He chose the desert because there was nothing there that could remind him of the life he'd lost. He sold what was left, bought an old trailer, and headed toward the void. Nevada seemed like a good place to die slowly, far from pitying gazes and suffocating memories. The new routine wasn't life, it was survival. Mark woke up without reason, dragged himself to the trailer's makeshift kitchen, made strong coffee, and drank it in silence. Most of the day was filled with mechanical gestures, sharpening tools, tinkering with old radios, disassembling engines just to reassemble them. There was no purpose in any of it. It was just the act of keeping his hands busy so his mind wouldn't crush him completely. At night, he'd light a cigarette and stand staring at the horizon, waiting for the dark to swallow him. Inside the trailer, the walls were laden with memories, photos framed with tape, objects that belonged to his son, a worn cap, a keychain he could never throw away. All of it tied him to a life that no longer existed. But, paradoxically, they were also the only proof that the boy had been real. Mark knew that without those memories, he might have given up for good. The days turned into months. The desert, with its scorching heat by day and unrelenting cold at night, seemed the perfect reflection of his soul. A place where nothing flourished, nothing renewed, where only silence reigned. The nearest neighbours were miles away, and the only visitors were truckers passing hastily on the distant road, carrying goods and dreams that weren't his. Yet, there was a strange kind of empathy beginning to form between Mark and the desert itself. He knew he wasn't alive in the fullest sense, but he wasn't dead either. Like those arid lands, he existed in a suspended state, resilient, but empty. And that's exactly why, on that October night in 1996, when the impossible revealed itself before his eyes, Mark wasn't ready, not prepared, not willing. He was just a man who had gone to the desert to disappear in silence. What he didn't know was that the desert, somehow, held secrets that not even his pain could smother. What came next wasn't just an inexplicable vision in the sky, but a collision between his hopelessness and something so vast, so improbable, that it would change the direction of his existence forever. The desert had its own nocturnal rituals. The cold took hold slowly, forcing the skin to shrink under the worn fabric of Mark's jacket. The wind whispered between the rocks, and the darkness seemed to devour every shadow, until only the stars remained, those silent witnesses to solitude. Mark had grown accustomed to this spectacle, a sky so vast it seemed to mock his smallness. But that night, something began to break the known pattern. As he took another drag from his cigarette, his eyes were drawn to an unusual point in the firmament. It wasn't a plane, not a satellite, not a shooting star. The light pulsed, as if breathing, advancing in abrupt movements that defied all logic. He frowned, trying to convince himself he was tired, that his mind was playing tricks. But the light didn't fade. On the contrary, it grew, approached until it dominated part of the horizon. Mark threw the cigarette to the ground, crushing the ember with his boot. His heart raced, but there was no sound, no engine, no propeller, nothing but the heavy breathing echoing in his own head. Then, without warning, the light descended. It didn't fall like something in freefall, didn't land like a heavy machine. It simply settled before the trailer, enveloping the space in ethereal brightness. The desert, previously plunged in shadows, now seemed bathed in silver. He backed up until he leaned against the trailer door, his fingers trembling. Part of him wanted to run, but another part, inexplicably, felt unable to turn away. It was as if he were held by invisible threads pulling him forward, and then it happened. From the light emerged a figure. The humanoid outline was undeniable, but everything else screamed difference. The skin reflected metallic tones between blue and silver, as if molded by moonlight itself. The eyes, large and luminous, didn't intimidate, but conveyed a deep calm, an invitation to silence. There was an aura around it, a vibration that seemed to cut through the air and land directly in Mark's heart. He couldn't say if he was facing a dream, a hallucination, or the most solid reality he'd ever experienced. The figure took a few steps forward. Its feet barely left marks in the sand. Mark felt his mouth dry up, but he couldn't form words. Everything in him screamed that he should feel fear. After all, he was facing the unknown. Yet, what grew inside him wasn't terror, but a strange and almost painful sense of peace. The being stopped a few meters away, and without moving its lips, something began to happen. A wave of images invaded Mark's mind. He saw fragments of memories, not his own, but belonging to that creature. A distant planet, skies of impossible colors, battles, destruction, then silence, a voluntary exile, an echo of solitude that didn't belong to Earth. Mark shuddered. He didn't understand how, but he knew he was accessing memories that weren't his. Suddenly, another flow passed through him. This time, it was his own pain being exposed. He saw his son's face, heard the crash of the accident again, relived the hospital room. And then, as if someone had extended an invisible hand, he realized the creature also felt his loss, not as an observer, but as someone who knew the weight of carrying an invisible wound. The communication was silent, without words. There was no language, just direct exchanges of feelings and memories. Mark didn't know its name, but the idea arose in his mind as if whispered deep in his soul. Lyra. He brought his hands to his face, trying to hold back the tears that came unannounced. It had been years since he'd cried like this. Lyra, with her shining eyes, neither retreated nor advanced. She simply remained there, radiating a serenity that contrasted with the chaos inside him. For an instant, Mark felt as if he weren't alone in the universe, not in the generic sense of distant stars, but in an intimate, tangible connection that crossed the void. Time lost meaning. It could have been minutes or hours. Mark didn't know. What he did know was that something inside him, hardened by pain, was beginning to move. The presence of that strange visitor wasn't a threat. It was a mirror, a reflection that even beings from other worlds could carry scars that never closed. In that silence illuminated by the ship's light, Mark had the impression that it wasn't he who had witnessed an apparition, but that he had been found, and that, in itself, changed everything. Before we continue, if this story is already gripping you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment your opinion. This helps us continue bringing amazing stories like this. The desert's silence that night seemed to have been redesigned. The sound of the wind still existed, but it was distant, muffled, as if the world had decided to step back to allow just two beings, so improbable for each other, to share the same space. Mark remained motionless, trying to understand what was happening, when new waves of images and feelings began to cross his mind. They weren't his memories. They were fragments of what Lyra carried with her. He saw, as if looking through fogged glass, the reflection of a world he didn't know. Skies in deep green tones, seas that gleamed like crystal under two moons. But the beauty soon turned to chaos. Battles, explosions, cities destroyed by invisible forces. Mark felt in his own body the weight of exhaustion, the cold of loss, the weariness of a war that seemed endless. He saw Lyra, surrounded by others of her kind, fighting, resisting, until finally everything reduced to silence and exile. She didn't need to say anything. Mark understood. She had lost something too, perhaps everything. And in that Nevada desert, it wasn't just a broken human and a silver-skinned alien who met. They were two survivors from different worlds, united by the same scar. The pain of continuing to exist when no purpose was seen in going on. Mark took a deep breath, almost gasping, as those images faded. His heart still beat hard, but it wasn't just fear anymore. It was recognition. For the first time since his son's death, he saw himself reflected in another being, even if that being came from beyond human comprehension. He tried to speak, but the words died in his mouth. Then in response, his mind was invaded again. Only now it wasn't Lyra showing her past. It was a kind of mirror, his own memories being revisited, but this time with her as witness. The little boy running through the workshop, laughter echoing among the tools. The day of the accident, the hospital, the emptied life. He closed his eyes, fighting the wave of pain. But when he opened them, he saw Lyra standing before him, motionless, but with eyes shining with a different intensity, as if, somehow, she had understood every piece of that story. There was a moment when the entire desert seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them. There was no language, no need for explanations. What was building there wasn't conversation, but a bond made of shared losses. And Mark realized that the solitude that had consumed him for years was no longer so unique. There was someone, even from another world, who understood the weight of being a survivor. It was strange how the human mind resisted less when the heart began to open. Mark, accustomed to protecting himself, to building invisible walls against others' compassion, felt those walls crumble effortlessly before Lyra's presence. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was her nature. Maybe that silent communication. Maybe simply fate. But he knew, deep down, it wasn't chance. Lyra took a step forward, the light on her skin oscillating slightly, as if responding to her own heart. Mark felt the urge to pull away, but he couldn't. And then came the most painful, and at the same time, most liberating realization. He wasn't alone in his pain. She had also given up fighting. She too had chosen exile, far from everything she knew. Somehow their meeting seemed inevitable, as if two rivers broken by the path needed to meet at the same dry point in the desert. What was born that night wasn't friendship, nor immediate trust, but something deeper, recognition, the certainty that, even in worlds separated by stars, pain spoke the same language. Mark raised his eyes to the sky. The vastness no longer seemed so indifferent. For the first time in years, he wasn't just looking at the void, he was looking at something that returned the gaze. And in that silent exchange, a thin thread of hope began to weave, almost imperceptible, but real. The hours that followed were a blur. Mark couldn't say if it was dawn or if time had stopped existing. The desert, silent, seemed merely a backdrop for something that surpassed it. Lyra remained before him, motionless, conveying a calm that kept him rooted to the ground, unable to flee, until, without warning, she began to move. There were no words. Just a subtle gesture, a look, a mental sensation that said, "Come." Mark hesitated, but his feet obeyed. He followed her into the darkness, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The brightness enveloping her served as a guide, illuminating the sand, the rocks, the vastness. They walked for minutes that felt like hours, until they finally reached a spot far from the trailer, where the ground felt harder, almost metallic. It was then that Mark saw it. Half buried in the sand, camouflaged by time and neglect, lay the carcass of something impossible. It wasn't a plane, not a helicopter, not human technology. Before him rested the skeleton of an ancient ship, marked by wear and the impact of a crash that must have happened years ago. Mark approached slowly, like one approaching a forbidden sanctuary. He touched the cold metal, corroded in places, and felt a strange vibration run through his fingers. Instinct spoke louder. He didn't need explanations to recognize it was a broken machine, and broken machines always called for hands willing to restore them. Lyra stopped beside him. There was no speech, but a silent revelation. She couldn't leave without that repair. Her exile was tied to that ship. The look she gave Mark wasn't pleading. but one of surrender, as if entrusting him with her last chance. Mark took a step back, trying to process. For years, he had refused to fix himself, plunging into silence, choosing not to fight. Now, before something that didn't belong to his world, he felt the old impulse awaken, the need to try, to restore what had been destroyed. The ship was immense and complex, and even without understanding it, Mark saw familiarity in the details. Circuits, panels, damaged systems. They weren't car engines, but still machines, and machines always spoke to him, even in another language. For an instant, he felt himself back in the workshop again, with his son watching beside him, curious, asking questions. His heart tightened, and the memory nearly paralyzed him. But Lyra's presence prevented him from sinking. She conveyed patience, as if she knew that work wasn't just about metal and wires, but about a man trying to remember what it felt like to have purpose. Mark took a deep breath. The sensation was clear. That ship wasn't just hers. Somehow it was his too. A perfect mirror of his own life. Crashed, damaged, abandoned in the desert, but still holding the possibility of flying again. He ran his hand over the corroded fuselage and murmured under his breath, almost like a promise to himself, "Maybe I can." Lyra tilted her head slightly, and for a moment, Mark had the impression she had understood every word. That secret buried in the sand wasn't just the key to a lost traveler's return. It was also a call for Mark to face the question he'd avoided since his son's death. What to do with what's left of me? That night, amid the silence cut by the wind and the impossible presence of an alien with luminous eyes, Mark found what he never expected. Not an answer, but a reason to try. The next morning, Mark woke with a sensation he hadn't felt in years. The weight of purpose. The sun was already peeking behind the distant mountains, spreading orange tones over the desert. He was still stunned by what he'd lived the night before. But the memory of the ship wasn't a nebulous dream. It was real. The image of it, crashed and silent under the sand, still pulsed in his mind like a call. He grabbed his old toolbox, full of rusty wrenches and worn pliers, and walked to the spot where Lyra waited. The creature seemed not to have moved during the night, but there was a serene patience in her, almost inhuman. Her eyes followed him as he approached, and Mark felt she understood. He had accepted the challenge. The first contact with the ship was overwhelming. The interior was filled with strange systems, cracked panels, circuits that resembled nothing human. For anyone else, it would be an insurmountable abyss, but Mark didn't back down. He touched each wire, each structure, as if seeking to translate a lost language. He didn't understand the logic, but he understood the essence. It was a broken machine, and broken machines had a way of speaking to him. With improvisation, he began to experiment. He took pieces of scrap from old cars he had around the trailer, used makeshift cables, adapted rusty gears. Each piece seemed inadequate, but little by little, he found ways to make them work within something beyond his comprehension. Where there was no compatibility, there was ingenuity. Where knowledge was lacking, intuition abounded. Lyra watched him closely. Sometimes, with a simple touch on his arm, she transmitted mental images revealing how certain connections should fit. They weren't detailed instructions, but impressions, visual guides that helped him understand. With each advance, however small, Mark felt a spark grow inside him. He wasn't just fixing a ship. He was rescuing a piece of himself he'd buried with his son. The work became routine. During the day, the sun beat down, but Mark stayed by the ship, sweating, testing, adapting. At night, when the cold took hold, he'd sit beside Lyra in silence. There were no dialogues as humans know them, but there was exchange. Images, feelings, memories. On some nights, he'd relive memories with his son and feel that Lyra understood each one. On others, it was she who shared fragments of destroyed worlds, cities he'd never see, battles that had left irreparable marks. This companionship shaped something unexpected. A bond, two broken beings, working side by side on something impossible. Mark began to notice he woke earlier, that the coffee no longer tasted bitter, that his steps had rhythm. The pain was still there, but now there was something pushing it beyond despair, the drive to finish what they'd started. With each small progress, the desert seemed to witness his transformation, a panel lighting up again, a circuit responding, a light flickering for the first time in years. And with it, Mark's life, once grey and paralyzed, began to reignite. But it wasn't easy. The work demanded constant improvisation. Often the metal refused to respond, cables burned, adaptations failed. In each failure, frustration threatened to return him to the man who'd given up on everything. But looking at Lyra, who remained steadfast by his side, he found strength to continue. It was as if the two of them were fixing more than the ship. They were rebuilding each other. And little by little, Mark began to feel something he didn't dare name. Hope. A timid, fragile hope. But one that grew with each tightened bolt, each spark that shone again. For the first time since the tragedy, he had a reason to get out of bed that wasn't just survival. In that desert, surrounded by nothing, Mark discovered that even the impossible could be attempted, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the impossible was exactly what he needed to live again. The desert has a peculiar way of devouring time. Days and nights blur into a cycle of scorching heat and biting cold, until the notion of weeks begins to dissolve. For Mark, that detail had always been irrelevant. Before Lyra, it didn't matter if it was Tuesday or Saturday, but now each day carried a new weight. The ship still wasn't ready, and with each frustrated attempt, time became a silent enemy. At first, the failures were just technical obstacles, cables that burned, systems that didn't respond, improvised parts that couldn't withstand the pressure. Mark dealt with each problem as he'd always dealt with engines, patience, trial and error. But soon he realized it wasn't just the ship suffering from wear. Lyra was changing too. The skin that once shone in metallic tones now seemed to lose intensity. Her movements grew slower, as if the desert's gravity weighed more on her than on any human. Mark, without needing explanations, understood. Time in that environment wasn't natural for her. Her presence on Earth exacted a high price, and he could see her energy draining with each passing day. Despair, once buried under layers of resignation, began to resurface. Each time he saw her weaken, memories of his son burst into his mind like daggers. The same tightness in his chest, the same impotence, the same rage at not being able to fight the inevitable. At night, when Lyra slept silently beside the ship, Mark would sit staring at the sky, and he'd ask himself, with tears held back, "Am I going to lose her too?" He tried to push those thoughts away by diving into the work, but time pressed him like never before. Every wasted minute seemed a step closer to failure, and with that, the ghost of his grief became unbearable. The makeshift workshop in the middle of the desert turned into a stage of fury. Tools thrown against the ground, muttered curses, silence broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. Lyra, even weak, watched him, and in crucial moments, she'd extend her hand, transmitting soft images, a calm sea, an untouched forest, a memory of serenity. They weren't solutions, but anchors, and no matter how much Mark resisted, those visions made him stop, breathe, recompose himself. It was as if she were telling him without words, "Don't give up." Still, with each failure, the weight of grief pulled him back. He relived the hospital, the cold bed, the feeling that every attempt was futile. But there was a difference now. Years ago, when his son had passed, Mark had chosen to flee, to hide. This time, there was nowhere to run. The desert offered no refuge. Lyra didn't allow him the luxury of disappearing. And that's how something began to change. Despair turned into fuel. Mark realized he couldn't afford to repeat the mistake of the past. He hadn't saved his son, but maybe he could save Lyra. Each adjusted piece, each reconnected system was a battle against time, against death, against himself. The desert, which once symbolized his surrender, now became a battlefield. The sand received his sweat, his tears, and even his blood when cuts and wounds arose amid the relentless work. He was no longer the man who gave up at the first failure. Now each failure was just a step, each fall a reason to try again. Lyra, in her growing fragility, followed everything with eyes that, even weakened, still shone with something unshakable. Trust, and that silent trust was what kept Mark from succumbing. Time continued to race, merciless, and the sense of urgency became unbearable. But amid the chaos, Mark discovered something he never expected. The courage to face not just the challenge before him, but also the ghost he carried inside. And in that desert, before a nearly dead ship and a companion fading away, Mark realized it wasn't just Lyra who needed saving, it was himself. The night arrived colder than usual, as if the desert itself sensed the weight of what was about to happen. The wind blew thin between the rocks, and the immense sky seemed more laden with stars than usual. Mark was exhausted, His arms ached, his hands were full of calluses and cuts, and his eyes burned from the continuous effort. But inside him was something he hadn't felt in years: determination. The ship rested before him like a sleeping beast. For the first time, some of its systems were back to life. Intermittent lights blinked in bluish tones, metallic sounds vibrated from within the fuselage, and a low hum began to course through the ground. It wasn't ready, it wasn't perfect, but it was alive. Lyra, weaker than ever, watched everything with eyes that shone not from her body's energy, but from the intensity of what was happening. There was in her a mix of gratitude and farewell, as if she already knew the moment was arriving. Mark, on his knees beside an improvised panel, took a deep breath. Every connection he'd made was precarious. Every human-adapted piece to impossible technology was a risk. But there was no more time for hesitation. Either it worked now, or it never would. He closed his eyes for an instant and saw his son's face, not as a memory of pain, but as if he were there, smiling, encouraging him not to back down. It was as if his entire life had converged to that instant. A man who had lost everything, now having the chance to save something that wasn't his, but that somehow returned to him the feeling of being alive. Mark stood, wiped his hands on his grease-stained overalls, and looked at Lyra. "This is it," he murmured, not knowing if she'd understand. She didn't respond with words. She just raised her hand and transmitted a wave of images. Green fields, impossible skies, a home she'd lost, and with it, a single feeling: hope. With a firm gesture, Mark activated the panel. The hum increased, the lights lit up in sequence, and the sand around began to vibrate slightly. The ship was awakening. He took a few steps back, heart pounding, watching as the hull illuminated in patterns he'd never seen. Lyra approached the ship's entrance. Her movements were slow, fragile, but carried a dignity that seemed greater than the weight of her debilitated body. Before crossing the forming opening, she stopped before Mark. For a few seconds, the two stood motionless, exchanging not words, but truths. Mark felt a final wave of feelings pass through him: gratitude, recognition, and a message as clear as the desert sun. What is broken can be transformed. Tears streamed down his face. For the first time, they weren't just tears of grief, but also of liberation. He was no longer the man who had fled to the desert just to disappear. He was someone who had made a difference. Lyra entered the ship. The metallic portal closed softly, and the structure came fully to life. The air vibrated with energy. The sand danced in spirals around it, and a deep, almost sacred sound took over the night. Mark backed away, shielding his face from the forming wind, but didn't avert his eyes. With an intense light, the ship rose slowly, defying gravity. It ascended without roar, just with the majesty of something that didn't belong to Earth. Mark followed it with his gaze until it became just a bright point in the sky, and then disappeared among the stars. The desert returned to silence, but this time it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of meaning, as if every grain of sand held the memory of what had just happened. Mark stood there for long minutes, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. Something inside him had also departed, but at the same time something had been restored. For the first time in years, he didn't feel just absence. He felt belonging, and as he looked at the now empty sky, he knew with absolute clarity he would never be the same again. The desert returned to silence, but it was no longer the same silence that once crushed Mark. He remained standing, motionless, looking at the sky where the ship had vanished. The air still carried a trace of electricity, as if the particles around held the memory of the impossible. The sand, once cold and indifferent, now seemed charged with stories. And Mark, alone again, felt the weight of that transformation. For years, he'd believed emptiness was all that remained, that life was just a space between pain and forgetting. But that night, seeing Lyra disappear among the stars, something changed. Silence was no longer empty. It was presence. It was witness to him having been part of something greater than himself. He staggered back to the trailer, body exhausted, but mind in a whirlwind. He sat at the table where so many times he'd sat motionless before the crackling radio, and realized that place no longer served him the same way. The walls, covered in memories and photographs, were no longer a tomb. They were proof that memory could coexist with life. He hadn't brought his son back, but he'd discovered that love doesn't die when the body does. And somehow, Lyra had helped him see that. In the following days, Mark began to write. He took old notebooks, forgotten pens, and recorded every detail of what he'd lived. Not as someone writing a manual or proof, but as someone needing to carve into paper the certainty that he hadn't gone mad. He described the first encounter, the impossible light, the silence that didn't threaten, the luminous eyes, the broken ship. He wrote about the relentless work, the nights of despair, and the final moment when she departed. The words came heavy at first, but soon turned into a continuous flow. It was as if the story wasn't just his, but a legacy that needed to be recorded. He didn't know if anyone would believe it, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that, for the first time since the tragedy, he wanted to tell something, wanted to share, wanted to exist. The night sky became his new companion. Every night, Mark would step out of the trailer, sit before the horizon, and search for the brightest star. He imagined that somewhere, Lyra was still looking at that same sky, perhaps remembering him the same way. That simple idea was enough to warm a heart that had been frozen for years. The desert had changed for him too. Where he once saw only dead space, he now perceived signs of life. The sound of coyotes was no longer lament, but part of a larger symphony. The wind wasn't a threat, but a constant reminder that everything moves, that nothing remains unchanged. Even silence had become a companion. Mark never went back to being the same man who'd lost his son. That wound would never cease to exist, but he stopped being the man who'd fled to the desert to disappear. Now, each day carried a reminder that even the improbable can happen, and that if the impossible had been able to land before his eyes, perhaps his life still had paths to tread. He became someone who observed more, reflected more, wrote more. He discovered that his story, no matter how improbable, needed to be told, not just because it might inspire others, but because in telling it, he remembered he was alive. And so, the man who once chose the desert to die slowly discovered that sometimes new beginnings don't arrive in bustling cities or crowds. They arrive in silence, in solitude, in the improbable. They arrive when a ship lands before your trailer, when luminous eyes remind you that pain isn't exclusively human, and when someone, even from another world, shows you that what is broken can, yes, be restored. In that immense sky, Mark found not just the stars. He found himself. The universe has a strange way of surprising those who expect nothing anymore. Mark, the man who had chosen the desert as a silent grave, discovered that even the most improbable can find a broken heart. His life, marked by tragedies and the weight of grief, was crossed by something no human manual could explain: the encounter with the impossible. What began as a night of silence and cigarette under the stars turned into an unexpected call. He wasn't seeking answers, wasn't asking for miracles, wasn't begging for signs. Still, the universe found him. Through Lyra, he discovered that solitude isn't exclusively human, that even beings from the stars carry invisible wounds and voluntary exiles. Fixing the ship was much more than mechanical work. It was a process of inner restoration. With each bolt, each spark, each attempt, Mark rediscovered not just his mechanics skill, but his capacity to feel. He learned that life doesn't end when we lose someone. It continues, even broken, even wounded, because there's always something to fix, inside or out. When the ship finally departed, taking Lyra back to whatever remained of her destiny, Mark wasn't left empty. On the contrary, for the first time in years he was full of memories, full of purpose, full of a certainty he'd never had before. What is broken can be transformed. The desert was no longer the tomb of his hope. It had become the stage for his silent resurrection. He would never look at the sky the same way again. Every star was now a reminder that life is greater than pain, that there are mysteries beyond comprehension, and that even those who gave up can be surprised by a new beginning. Mark's story isn't about a man who saw a ship. It's about someone who learned that even the end can be a disguise for rebirth. That, no matter how improbable, there's always a chance to repair, rebuild, breathe again. And if this message reaches you now, perhaps it's not just coincidence. Perhaps it's the universe reminding you that your life, no matter how broken it seems, still holds the possibility of being restored. If this story touched you, share this video, leave your comment, and don't forget to subscribe. Who knows, maybe you're closer to a new beginning than you think.